Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics.
Mark Drakeford has announced that he will be stepping down as First Minister in March 2024. After trailing his decision in the press recently, he is fulfilling his promise to step down after 5 years in the role. 5 long and eventful years that put him and his government front and centre of people's lives in Wales in a way that no other Welsh First Minister has experienced. How will he and his term leading the national government be reflected on? What are the objectives for his final few months in post? And with the UK party likely to win at the next union-wide general election, what should we expect from the most consequential Welsh Labour leadership race in history? To discuss this, we are joined by our 2 Welsh Labour whisperers, our very own Matthew Hexter.
Hello there, Richard.
And political commentator and good friend of the pod, Liz Silversmith.
Good evening.
Good evening, and may I say how fine you sound, Liz.
It's almost like I have a great microphone on.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. Matthew, can I start with you? What just happened and why did it happen?
Well, Mark Drakeford, as you said, has just decided that he's going to retire as First Minister of Wales. He spoke from the Oriel of the Senedd this morning, announcing that he will leave the post of First Minister in March of 2024. In terms of why this has happened, well, I think Mark thinks it's time. Mark has always said since he was elected that he would only serve 5 years in the role. And today, being 5 years to the day he was elected as First Minister, I think he felt it was the apt moment to announce his intention to retire.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already had some messages from friends and family being like, whoa, what happened? Why is he resigning? And I've been saying, he actually said from the very beginning, he was only going to do 5 years or so. He's mentioned a few different milestones. He said 5 years. He said when I'm 70. He said midterm, all of which all of these today, all of those sort of coincide. We're about midterm through the Senedd term. He is 70, just about to turn 70.
Next year.
Thank you, Matt. And we've got to keep track of Mark's birthdays. And yeah, and I think Matt's right. He's been through a lot. I mean, I think extremely stable government, considering what we've been through and considering what's been going on across the border. When you think of in Wales, Drakeford's overseen the pandemic and Brexit together. I think it's time.
It's also, I think, a mark of the man that he's had an incredibly difficult year personally as well with the loss of his wife. And I think the man has the strength of an ox to carry on in the role as long as he has after that very horrible and traumatic experience for himself. And I think it is a testament to his sense of public duty and obligation that he's stayed in the role as long as he has. And obviously to a time where he thinks that he can now have an organised leadership election for his successor. Very
quickly, I wonder if we should just cover some of the things that he talked about in terms of his commitments, things that he wants to see through. In the past, we've talked about some of the projects and legislation that has been key to his outlook as Welsh Labour leader and First Minister. We talked about the social partnership bill and various other things in the past. What is the business that he wants to make sure is done under his watch before he steps down?
He's done quite a lot, but like I say, I think he probably regrets himself that there was a lot more that I expect was on his to-do list, and then a pandemic happened. And anyone that's been working in the Cardiff Bay bubble has been dealing with just reams and reams of post-EU kind of tidying up, and that's a casual term. It's much more dramatic than that. You can essentially, both the UK government and devolved governments have been able to accept or rewrite EU legislation as they see fit. And as it happens, Scotland and Wales, for obvious reasons, have decided to keep quite firm alignment with previous EU principles, let's say. So he's done, I mean, over the last few years, I mean, there's been quite a few bills that have gone through, but I would say, honestly, just being that figurehead of the government when the government finally played a ridiculously high profile role in people's lives. You know, Mark Drakeford appeared on BBC News to tell you where you could go next week. He was subject to the sort of scrutiny that no First Minister before him has been subject to. And I think it's also timely, and I don't think it's on purpose. I think it's just an interesting timing that in, I think it's early spring, like February, March next year, is expected to give evidence to that COVID inquiry. So that really will be his this is what I did and why I did it final account. But yeah, in the Senate the last few years, we've had the Clean Air and Soundscapes bill. That's just finished. There was the bus reform stuff that hasn't actually finished yet. I'm looking at Matt because my sector, I focus on one policy area these days. The decisions he's made, there was a very controversial decision, which I don't think anyone will have forgotten, that the M4 Relief Road was never built. Carwyn Jones was going to build it, and that was a big line in the sand between Carwyn and Mark, is that Mark did all the due diligence and waited for the planning inspector reports. And this is a policy that's been around since Edwina Hart, so it's not, it's something that's been inherited from FM to FM. And he finally, even though the planning inspectorate said, our current planning rules go ahead, I suppose, he said, actually, no, I've spoken to environment charities, I've spoken to campaigners, I've been to the Gwent levels, and he's spoken to MSs like John Griffiths, who are really powerful in that. And he said, no, for environmental considerations, I'm overruling this. And that was an incredible sign to the sector that, wow, this guy doesn't really care what people think of him. He just wants to do what he needs to do.
You can take the boy out of Newport West, but I shall not speak about the M4. I think going back to what Liz says about the things that Mark wanted to do, but maybe not have had the opportunity to do, I think I want to call back to the interview we had with him, Rich, just before the Senate election, where he talked about his time involved in government in Wales. So whether that be his role as special advisor to Rhodri Morgan or the variety of ministerial roles he's held, I think there's one thing that's very clear is the impact of austerity on his plans. I think that you can see that if he'd had more money, we would have had a much more ambitious, progressive agenda for Wales. I think Mark's fundamental principle is is progressive universalism, and I think we would have seen much more happen in that ilk in the policy of the Welsh Government had they had the resources to do it. I think one thing that's going to be very contemporary for people listening to this discussion now is what's going to happen with Senedd reform. I think we're seeing that bill under more and more pressure in recent weeks. I think that the gender quotas part of that legislation is in real trouble, but the main part of the bill, i.e. increasing the number of Senedd members, is also now feeling extremely stressed and becoming much, much more hard to think that it's actually going to happen. I still think it will, for what it's worth, but I think it's going to be very difficult to get through.
And he did do the first 50-50 gender balanced cabinet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And he's been very clear with his aims in that area. But I think that I don't think that March timeline for him leaving is just happenstance. I think that's when a lot of people are predicting that the Senedd reform bill will go through. So I think he wants to usher that in before he leaves. I think that's what he really wants to be his legacy in terms of this sort of nation building effect on the Senedd and Wales. But I think fundamentally, he's always going to be the COVID FM. I mean, we can try as hard as we may to create our own legacies, but unfortunately, they tend to be written for us. And he will always be the COVID FM.
It's events, dear boy, events, isn't it? It's I would literally was struggling to think of the bills because all I could think of was COVID and Brexit. But I'm just bringing up some notes, and yeah, he has actually done quite a bit. I mean, that social partnership and procurement bill is obviously his baby, as it were, for legislatively. But the Senedd reform he feels very passionately about. He's always been a very pro devolution, lest we forget his background, spad to Rhodri Morgan. He's ushered through devolution with his FMs by his side, but they have still managed to do a lot. The agriculture bill earlier this year was no mean feat. He's got the Plaid co-op agreement that's been held up with Adam Price and Rena Pureworth to keep Labour a working majority. And they've also done quite a bit on developing Welsh taxes. I mean, setting it up to modify Welsh taxes, I should add. No one's ever modified a Welsh tax. But yeah, they banned single-use plastic products. Like he's put climate change and nature really front and centre with the climate change and deputy climate change minister. He obviously suffered the brunt of, along with Lee Waters, of the 20-mile-per-hour stuff, even though this is pretty bold, low-traffic neighbourhood stuff. This is stuff that even the Scottish Greens and Scottish Government can't get through.
Yeah, on 20 mile an hour, I think it's worth just picking at that a bit. I think it's quite clear that 20 mile an hour policy, or at least the handling and communication element of that policy, has started to have a negative impact on Welsh Labour polling, and Mark's own personal polling as well. And I think that, we were talking about whether this was a surprise, really. And again, I don't think it's necessarily a surprise My understanding is that Mark has tried to stand down a couple of times already this year, but it felt by those in Transport House that they wanted him to lead any general election campaign because he was the most popular politician in the history of Wales, the most well-known politician in the history of the Senedd. So I think they wanted him to be front and center of that campaign. But as his favourability has declined, I think the incentive for Welsh Labour to keep him around in that sort of figurehead role has also declined at the same time.
Yeah, and just in that legacy as well, you mentioned his earlier ministerial career. Although his role as health minister was as troubled as everybody else's time in the health ministerial job, his time as finance minister also brought in the fiscal framework, which is now we're looking at being remodelled, being picked up by Northern Ireland because it's been seen as such a success in terms of kind of providing a baseline of income and a guarantee of future income. He generally won quite a lot of plaudits, particularly in that role as finance minister before he became first minister as well.
So, it wasn't an easy, it's never been an easy job, don't get me wrong, but he was an extremely resilient and reliable finance minister. And I think...
Was he also a rhythmical finance minister?
We'll get onto the fun stuff later, but he's sure got rhythm.
All the memes.
Casting my mind back to the previous Senedd before 2021, I think as a health minister, every single health minister struggles. The NHS in Wales is just structurally a difficult beast to manage, let alone fund. But he did all right. I remember the public health bill well. We were monitoring together at the time, or not, certainly very near that time. And the public health bill fell when Mark Drake, and it was a more party political thing, the cheap date remark and all those things, but let's not get into that. But anyway, he tried to, funnily enough, it's come back into legislation proposals now, but he proposed to ban all vapes, disposable vapes, reusable vapes. He didn't want vaping to be a thing. He thought we've done really well with smoking, let's not make vaping a thing, and it fell, came back the next term without those proposals in. He also attempted local government reform, again, something no one's ever managed really properly, and yet everyone in Wales would agree that having more councillors than MSs and the sheer amount of councils and wards could easily be reformed, but he didn't manage that either. I think the fact he tackled either of them was impressive. He's also done things like votes at 16 where he can in local government. He's also banned letting agency fees under various renting homes legislation, reformed housing. He's kept council budgets as stable as he can. But he's really passionate about social services and health and the safety net of government and what it provides to its citizens. And I think he would be proud if he left a legacy of a Welsh citizen feels slightly safer or more free prescriptions. It is the symbolic policy. He protected free prescriptions when he easily could have started charging them anytime he wanted.
We probably should move on. I just have a sort of thought. We've done a little bit of a dive into the history books there. I think we probably would do our listeners, particularly maybe younger listeners, good service if we compared his tenure to his predecessors as First Minister. I'm going to roll Alan Michael into this conversation just because I don't have to go into the difference between a First Minister and a First Secretary.
Definitely counts.
It definitely counts. Definitely sort of counts.
Says the former Alan Michael staffer.
Former Alan Michael staffer's views count too.
How would we compare Mark Drakeford's tenure? I mean, you mentioned COVID and the profile that came with that as being obviously a differentiator. I mean, is that the main thing? Is that the main point of difference? But there has definitely been an evolution of the profile of First Ministers over time, even though their characters have not been wildly dissimilar.
Well, yes, they don't look wildly dissimilar, but I think working up close, I would say Mark's distinct leftyism. He is a left-wing guy. He is proudly a socialist. When was the last time you heard that in UK Labour? Can I hear Jeremy Corbyn somewhere? Like as a previous Corbynite, I seek Mark Drakeford's calm embrace of progressive, agreeable socialism with a centrist hint so no one gets too offended. But when he talks about progressive universalism and hey guys, check out that Hero blog I wrote about what is Drakefordism. I'll tweet it later. Yeah, he is quite lefty, and I'd say Alan was only there for the first year. He basically ushered in devolution in a very difficult background. Yeah, he suffered because he was a Blairite, as it were. He literally worked in Tony Blair's cabinet in Westminster. Who could blame anybody for saying, "Oh, Blair's just putting his favourite guy there"? He managed to step aside, I think, with grace in the end. But Rodri Morgan and Mark Drakeford are both distinctly left wing, the clear red water, etc. Whereas I'd say Carwyn and Allen were much more centre left of the Labour Party.
One of the things that's just interesting to draw a parallel with again is that we are on our third successive scheduled, well-executed transition of party leadership and leader of government role in Wales, and that is a pretty steep contrast to the shenanigans and skullduggery and all manner of other things that we've seen east of the border over the last few years. What does this tell us about the role of leader of Welsh Labour and the role of First Minister? Is this calm by nature, or is this calm transition happening because of the pure continued strength of the Welsh Labour Party?
Yes, a little bit to that last question, but also because without getting too geeky, there's no way.
Matthew, when we have guests on this podcast, they say, "Oh, I might be a bit geeky." You normally say something like, "You're at home here. You're among friends."
So there's no mechanism to get rid of the leader of Welsh Labour. So whilst you could theoretically, I imagine, have some sort of vote of no confidence in the First Minister, which may then trigger a Labour leadership election, there is no constitutional method by which MSs, MPs or members can get rid of a Welsh Labour leader. So that's probably one of the reasons why one of the reasons why it's not possible to have the sort of shenanigan-y leadership elections that have been seen by both UK Labour and the UK Conservative Party. But I also think that the sort of political centre of gravity in Wales is much closer together in terms of whom we elect as a Labour Party. I think that by the very nature of electing 200-300 people, you're going to have a much broader divide in terms of political ideologies, which I just don't think we see here in Wales. I've always said this, and I hold true to it, that in Wales, even our Blairites are quite left-wing. There is not that big of a difference. And if again, not getting into who's going to be next, but if you look at the main frontrunners for who could succeed Mark Drakeford, actually, in terms of their political identity and ideology, there's not a huge amount between them. So it is. I'm trying to think of the word. This sort of.
It's established. There's an established way of doing things from Welsh Government, and it's been a Welsh Labour government since 1999. So strong, robust funding of public services as much as they can, good relationships with trade unions so much they legislated for it, fighting back against any UK legislation they think is in devolved areas. That has been consistent of a Welsh Labour government, no matter whether they're in cooperation with Plaid Cymru or Lib Dems or whoever. I mean, hey, last term, we always forget, Kirsty Williams is in government, and that was Welsh Labour. Yes, it's called an electoral machine. Yes, it's very good at what it does, but ironically, the electoral system of the Senedd right now, it's going to change because of Mark and because of the work he did with Plaid Cymru and getting that through. So he needed a 2/3 majority. Let's do a geek off. how many rules and procedures from the Senedd can we bring up? But yeah, I think that is there is a Welsh Government thing. No First Minister candidate's now going to be like, right, rip it up. We're not prioritising schools, hospitals or people anymore. Like poverty, no one, and there's not going to be any massively pro-nationalist type Labour leader in this foreseeable future. It's going to go, yeah, you know what, Keir Starmer, we demand, let's assume Keir Starmer's in government, let's not get into that, but demand further devolution, demand justice, demand policing, demand all the next raft of powers. Because I think that's the next Senedd term. I will predict another Wales Act of some kind, if and only if there's a UK Labour government. But I think it's going to be what's the next one going to face is it's almost they're going to be facing these things because of what the previous First Minister's done, because of what they negotiated with the Devolution Acts.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because whoever is elected in this upcoming Labour leadership campaign is going to do something that no other Welsh Labour leader has had to do before, which is prepare for the election of a new UK Labour leader at Westminster, which is very much odds on. That's why I think this one is going to be particularly more consequential, because you're going to have somebody from Wales trying to influence that campaign to be able to get what they want ready for, potential Wales Act or whatever the legislative programme of that UK Labour government might be.
Or perhaps they'll go straight into what Keir used to talk about in his leadership campaign, the federal type structures and the things Gordon Brown has been talking about, and the constitutional convention that Carwyn kept talking about. These things have kind of been on the radar for a long
Absolutely, and that's why we like to have jokes in the podcast, because it really lightens the mood and such. Matthew,
Can I have one substantive point on this as well, Rich? Is that it's a very interesting thing you talk about the next UK Labour government. That's what I think we're all fairly happy that.
Just looking at the polls, that's all.
Looking at the polls, yeah.
They can ruin it still. They can mess it all up still.
Not to be Nostradamus about it or anything, but there is one fundamental question I think will really matter to the next Labour leader. For the last 13 years, the first line of defence for the Welsh Labour Party against any issue with public services has been that we are underfunded, chronically underfunded by a UK government led by the Conservative Party. What happens to that first line of defence when it is a UK government run by the Labour Party? And that is, I think, a fundamental question that whoever comes after Mark is going to have to think.
Do we have a Barnett formula klaxon at all?
Oh, we should do.
We should do.
It'd be the sound of air going out of a balloon or something rather than a klaxon.
That's what Barnett sounds like.
Yeah. With regards, we talked a little bit about some of the issues that Mark Drakeford has come in for criticism for. I think one of the things that's certainly from my point of view, I've noticed with Mark Drakeford in a way that it's something that has happened to him that hasn't happened to his predecessors, is that for all of the good faith criticism that he's had of his success or failure of him and his government, there's been an awful lot of bad faith criticism of Mark Drakeford. You don't have to spend too long on the rapidly crumbling edifice of Twitter or various other things to see him being described as an authoritarian, what's the Kim Jong Mark or whatever. It's all this
They're
kind
never
of
very
weird.
good. They could be pithier.
They could be pithier. I just want to kind of a touch on this because it kind of is a change in the way that the Welsh public and the UK public more widely have referred to the holder of the role. And I just wonder if this is kind of like the first time that threshold is crossed, where now the holder of the post of First Minister of Wales is now, in inverted commas, game for this kind of straw man kind of criticism. And what does that necessarily mean for the kind of discourse that we've had over the years here in Wales? I mean, this is a kind of new thing, and it is being given oxygen in Wales by certain people in Wales as well.
Public awareness is a double-edged sword. Unfortunately, even though the vast majority of polling at the time saw the public go, yes, we actually think our First Minister is doing really well with COVID, and we think that he's doing his best with a very bad hand, who's, literally staying up at night, counting how many people are dying in care homes and figuring out where the vaccines can go. I think the public really chimed and were in alignment with he was slightly more cautious in England overall. I mean, there's a million articles on how things different, but he was more cautious and a little bit more robust and strict on certain things. Because of these policies having more of a difference in people's lives, and 20 mile per hour was another sort of lightning bolt of, what do you call it, attracts that kind of vitriol. And you can have 100 people that agree, or 99 people that agree with a government, and one person that hates what they've done, and so that one person that will be shouting. The 99 other people have got better things to do than to troll Lee Waters or Mark Drakeford or any other minister for what they've done to their commute and how terrible it is. I actually think Welsh ministers are dealing with it pretty well, but it definitely must be really stressful. And I do wonder how much that puts off nominations for candidates putting themselves forward for nominations. You're nominating yourself for, memes of you being turned to a dictator every time you do something that's unpopular.
Matthew, can I throw to you the criticism that we've heard from these kinds of quarters, that in COVID, Mark Drakeford is criticised for doing things differently for the sake of it. And that is something that appears to be contradicted by the evidence that we've seen in the UK COVID inquiry. But of course, that criticism is sticking and again has been given oxygen by people who wish to believe that or wish to undermine the role of devolution in the United Kingdom. What do you think about the reflections on that time of COVID and the criticism that Mark Drakeford gets in that regard?
I think that this image of him as some sort of quote unquote dictator, is also often used by people who think of Mark Drakeford as some sort of crazy Welsh nationalist. And despite the hopes and prayers of, I'm sure, many people in the Welsh political bubble, that could not be further from the truth. Mark is one of the most pure ideological unionists you could ever hope to meet. He may not wave the union flag around above his head every 5 minutes, but in terms of how he thinks the state should function, he thinks there are certain functions that are best exercised at a UK level, which is why he has never really wanted to touch income tax powers. It's why he has never called for the devolution of welfare in a meaningful way. It's why he, during the COVID pandemic, made every effort to do exactly what was happening in England and in Scotland until such a point as which he felt it was unsafe to do so. So I just think it could not be further from the truth.
I was just going to say, I kind of almost forgot about that, but yes, he's always been incredibly insistent that shared, again, it's progressive universalism, but the UK nation does better on an ideological basis, on a strategic economic basis, as four nations with one shared treasury redistributes. He's always said that very consistently. It would have been interesting if he was of a different mindset, but yeah, it's a very good point to make.
And what always strikes me about when we think about COVID is how publicly Mark Drakeford was calling for improved coordination among the nations of the United Kingdom in response, and it appears to be that the pushback was mostly coming from number 10 at that time, or when they were sober. I can say that because I can edit it out. Sorry, no, I probably won't actually. Right. So, what do we think Mark Drakeford is going to do after he is no longer First Minister? Presumably he's going to stay on the back benches and see out this Senedd term. What do we expect him to do during that time?
I think he's going to be a really good backbencher. We were chatting about this before. I think he's going to be a really good backbencher. He's going to find a nice committee where he can talk about his interests. But also, I went to an event with him a couple of months ago, held in Bridgend, which was all about the constitutional future of the UK. And he was very clear that if there is a Labour government elected at a Westminster level, all this constitutional change has to happen within the first year of that Labour government, or it will never happen at all.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't shock me if he spent that first year of that Labour government until the Senedd election in 2026 acting as a grandee and statesman, trying to ensure that the UK Labour Party does what it says it would do and implement some constitutional change.
That might be a genuinely more difficult task than handling COVID, but we wait and see. Liz, sorry.
I was going to say, you've just popped a thought into my brain that only just occurred to me, that he will likely be invited to the House of Lords at some point. He is a First Minister, former First Minister, Right Honourable. So he could... I mean, David Ellis-Thomas and Leonard Morgan were great conduits during the last Wales Act between the Welsh Government and UK Labour even. The UK Labour and Welsh Labour do not talk as much as you think. And I'll just leave that there, but they do not. And I think that's a really good prediction, that he will use his influence and prestige and hopefully easy audience getting with UK ministers if they're empowered to say, right, you need to sort this out. He definitely has strong views on it, but he's also been very careful in how he advances them. So I'd love to see. I've never said that. I barely say anything about the House of Lords, but for once, I'd love to see someone in the House of Lords because it would be a good place. But I almost think he'd just say, no, actually, I'd rather do it from here. I don't want to pop up to London that regularly. I've got my allotment to tend to. I really hope he gets a lot more allotment time when he's a backbencher.
He would also be the first leader of Welsh Labour moved to the House of Lords.
He would, yeah.
Well, that's never happened before, is it? Carwyn Jones, there was talk of Carwyn Jones being nominated for the House of Lords. That's never materialised as yet. In fact, he has a professorship at Aberystwyth University, which is far more prestigious. So it's a bit premature, but kind of equally inevitable that we start looking forward to the future leadership election that will inevitably start in really motoring forward today. Before we start sort of think about the individuals, Matt, I wonder if you could sort of outline what you think how that election will be run, what's the nomination process, what are the rules, and what is the timeline, I think, importantly, for the election that is to come.
So I'll cover the last point first, because as we are recording now, the Welsh Executive Committee of the Labour Party is meeting to discuss timescales. But from what we can see, it's likely that there will be a victor by the end of March. And from what I've heard today, talking to people, it's likely that nominations will open at some point next week. In terms of the actual rules of the contest and how you get on the ballot, that's a little bit more complicated. So Welsh Labour had a special conference a little while ago to approve the Senedd reform proposals. But on that day, at the same time, they also changed their leadership rules. So firstly, to be the next leader of Welsh Labour, you must be a member of the Senedd group. Seems fairly commonsensical, right? I've had some very difficult arguments with people on the left of the Labour Party sometimes about why they didn't think that was right. But anyway, it's the rules. We're sticking to them. But to get on the ballot, members must get either 20% of the Senedd Labour group, which is 6 in this current configuration, or 10% of the Senedd Labour group, so 3, plus 20% of CLPs, constituency Labour parties for the uninitiated.
And how many CLPs are there?
Now 32, because we've already moved over to that, or 3 affiliates, of which 2 must be trade unions, representing at least 5% of the affiliated membership. So you either get 6 MSs that back you, or 5 plus yourself, or you get 3 MSs plus what's 20% of 32, 6.5, so 7 CLPs.
It's that half vote that's really hard to get.
Yeah, really hard, yeah. Or 3 affiliates, 2 of which must be trade unions, and you'd probably need one of the big trade unions. So either Unison, GMB, or Unite.
So what you're saying is a really streamlined, straightforward process.
That is one of the most wonderful Welsh Labour fudges I've ever seen. Absolutely designed by the left of the party to try and make it so that more people could theoretically be on the ballot, to give members the best representative choice. However, it ends up as a maths soup that you have to then try and work out. From what I can tell from the conversations I've had, I don't think we'll need the complicated maths soup, but it's there in case anyone does need it.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation of what is quite a painful and complex web of ways of making sure that we have a representative suite of candidates nominated. Speaking of which, who are, we all know this very well. I suspect our listeners do already, but maybe Liz, you could outline who our potential candidates are and what we anticipate their, to use an Americanism, what their lanes are. Because we used to do American elections back in the day, didn't we, Matthew? It's quite nice to think about what.
We'll have to do that again.
We'll have to do it again, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, all the 2 front runners you'll read in every BBC and ITV article, of course, are Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles. The reason why they're front runners is just kind of this broad assumption that happens in Welsh politics sometimes. Vaughan Gething's obviously run before. Last time it was Mark versus Vaughan and Elenid. Elenid had a struggle to get on the ballot. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there was a lot of discussion last time, which I dare say will be repeated, about how depressing it would be to have just 2 men running for leader of Wales, as they are going straight into a First Minister position. It's not just an opposition leader. Vaughan Gething ran last time, and he's always been quite clear about his ambitions, although I've loved the last couple of years of interviews. Every single time a journalist asks them, they go, I'm not talking about that right now, it's not the time. So I'm so pleased it's now the time, and the next interview they get will finally be like, right, so are you running? Yeah. So we're expecting Vaughan, and we're expecting Jeremy. He didn't run last time. I think he was considering it but decided not to. He's been around the Labour bloc for a while, even if he's only been elected since, is it 2021 intake?
16.
Thought so, yeah, no, he is longer than that, yeah, thank you guys. Can't be a perfect geek all the time. And yeah, Jeremy, he's been Education Minister, big portfolio. Elenid could run again. I've certainly heard that she might run again. I've heard Hannah Blythen might run. She is, one of the more, I'm not going to try and put Hannah in a box here, but she is a more to the public, modern face of Welsh Labour. She is a younger woman. She is openly gay. She is, the modern female that a lot of people in Welsh Labour wish to see, and a lot of the women that have benefited from Labour's kind of shortlist and gender balanced processes. So it would be those are the names I've heard. But you never really know who's having conversations behind closed doors. And if they don't announce they want to, it's more because they don't want to be embarrassed by not having the nominations. I would be fascinated to be a fly on the wall in Senedd offices this week, because I would think quite a lot of people like the idea but never would.
I think it's important to get, if anyone's going to do it who isn't necessarily a front runner, like the four that Liz just talked about, they would do it soon. Because last time round, Alan Davis and Hugh Davis decided they were going to announce, but did it far too late. So by which point the nominations had already sort of been eaten up by the front runners, and they basically ended up with only themselves to nominate themselves.
Are you saying Alan Davis and Hugh Davis, one of them might want to run this time?
I'm not saying anything like that.
Wouldn't say anything like that.
I'm not saying anything like that. But all I'm saying is that if there were candidates, because you hear this all the time, everyone says to me, "Oh, what about so and so? What about so and so?" And I've spent the last 6 months to a year going, probably not. But if there was anybody, Julie James wanting to win my beer keg bet against Rich, for example, if they wanted to do it, they'd have to do it pretty soon, because otherwise, these nominations are going to go imminently, especially if they open nominations next week. I think you easily see over half the nominations going within the first week or two.
The MSs also they've always been quite good at not having an argument in public. So if they disagree on front runners, they will be having those discussions behind closed scenes. I doubt you'll get any leaks about what they've discussed behind the scenes on that.
So just, obviously, some of those candidates have done tremendous podcast interviews in the recent times, Matthew, with your good self, in fact. So we'd encourage people to listen back to our interviews with Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles. However, for anybody who hasn't had the pleasure yet or doesn't really know these characters at all, could you kind of briefly outline in what ways they might be different to what has come before? What would be their pitch as leaders? I mean, are these all continuity Drakeford? Are these continuity Cadwyn-Jones, or are they their own people?
They're their own people, for sure. Matt, do you want to go first?
I would say I was looking back, because obviously this has happened today. I was looking back over some of the old election materials from the previous leadership election, and actually being quite surprised by, even though he's characterised as someone on the right of the Labour group, how progressive in a weird way Vaughan Gething's manifesto was at the last leadership election. I think, he portrayed himself as the change candidate, someone who was going to break from sort of continuity Drakefordism or at that time, this Morganite tradition that we've had in Welsh Labour. His slogan was, of course, "Change takes courage." So I think that it wouldn't surprise me if that's where he positions himself again, as a change candidate, a new fresh face for Welsh Labour. I think there's a perception that he'd be very close to Keir Starmer. And I think that we're going to get into the issues that will be in play during the leadership election in a bit, I'm sure. But I think that's going to be one of the big ones, like the kind of interplay, the relationship dynamics between Welsh and UK Labour, and what kind of, do you take a clear red water approach, etc. I think there's the perception, at least at the minute, that Vaughan is much closer to the UK Labour Party, though I don't think that's actually true. And then I think that there's Jeremy Miles, who I think will, as this Welsh-speaking, viewed as a very progressive, more of a left-wing candidate than Vaughan, perhaps, even though, again, I don't think that's necessarily true. So it wouldn't surprise me if he markets himself in a sort of, although a bit more dynamic and a bit more of a continuity Morganite, Drakefordite tradition. Elined, also, I think during the last leadership election, was, I think, very much more on the sort of right of the party in terms of her policy platform, although, again, not right at all, but more of the right, talking much more about economic growth. And then Hannah is a bit of the unknown entity, I think, really, isn't she, in terms of what she may stand on.
She's been Deputy Minister for the Environment, and she's been Deputy Social Partnership Minister, but she hasn't held the high cabinet office, as it were, yet. I mean, I'm not sure where her politics lies, as it were, but Matt's not wrong. Everything everything around Welsh Labour. Vaughan Gething is not that far from Mark Drakeford. He's a bit more pro-business, whatever that means. He's now economy minister, so he certainly had a good few years getting to grips with, because the economic issues facing Wales are quite specific. It's things like steel, it's things like jobs leaving, jobs going to different countries, jobs coming to different countries, and it's that kind of strategic post-Brexit UK market stuff. He will be intimately familiar with the Internal Market Act and the problems that can cause with trade and just, you know, certain discussions going on there. So yeah, I think Jeremy's had the education brief for some time, so it'll be interesting to see what he says about schools. He's implemented curriculum reform, but someone else started that before him.
And of course, you know, there are more changes to the school year coming at this Senedd term as part of that will obviously come as part of Jeremy Miles's brief, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the context of the leadership contest. So, Liz, one of the things that we've known about for a long time is that Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles are likely to be there, and there has been this sort of third place on the podium reserved for a female candidate of some kind. And for, you know, previous elections that was Lynette Morgan, and actually she was lent votes to be on the ballot in the last leadership election. And it does feel a little bit like we are likely to see either Hannah Blythyn or Lynette there again this time, just to make sure that there's no woman on the ballot. That doesn't necessarily indicate that things have changed considerably inside the Labour Party over the last few years. Is this a sign of, is this a good thing to be doing for the party?
I mean, I think that having a token woman on the ballot, it's a shame that she's a token. That's in essence is what the Labour Party generally thinks. No one wants to do a woman shortlist. No one wants to have to say, can Carwyn Jones lend his vote to Elena just to make sure she's on the ballot, so the voters have a woman to vote for, even though she got the least nominations. And as Matt said, nominations are a great indicator of vote share. She got the lowest vote share too. What's funny about Welsh Labour politics is that there have been stalwart, fantastic women in very, very senior positions consistently through devolution. Since 1999, Jane Hutt has been in the front seat of the cabinet. She's essentially acted as deputy first minister many a time, yet she's never, ever, ever signaled she wants to go for it. We've got Leslie Griffiths and Julie James, big hitters in the cabinet, done some very difficult legislation of late, very difficult, which is always a good sign you'll be a good first minister if you can bring different groups together to agree on one thing and get it through the Senedd. They have never, ever said they want to go for it. So I think it's more of a culture of, why, I mean, one, maybe women are just smart enough to go, I'll just be in charge of all the environment or all of farming for all of Wales. That sounds like enough. Or is it a symptom of women facing more barriers in general in politics? Is it a symptom people can't be bothered to have their hair and makeup unpicked over? I don't think it's actually any of that. I actually think that Welsh Labour just generally is like whoever's the best leader for the time. We do quite well with gender in our list, we do quite well with gender in our Senedd members, and it's symbolic, and not even just symbolic, it's action. When they try to get those gender quotas to be in all parties, and that was the big contention, it's not just Labour doing their own party lists with gender balance, no, everyone's going to have to do gender balance lists, and there was such an upcry, and such an upcry it's going to go to court, and such an upcry has to be in a different bill. So for the Welsh Labour, they're almost beyond that of going, yeah, we've mainstreamed gender balance and everything to make sure women are there. So it's not the end of the world if our best leader happens to be a man again.
The problem here is, of course, the UK Labour Party feels this like an open sore because unlike the Conservatives and unlike almost every other party, it's never had a female leader at the UK party. And that is probably, presumably, Matthew, why this is always such a big issue.
Yes. And for what it's worth, I can't work out whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that this conversation always happens every time there's a leadership election, because it sort of shows that we know that morally it's a reprehensible thing to have a contest that is just two blokes, but it always does feel ever so slightly tokenistic. And I think that I would like to see the party get to a point where it's not just having a woman on the ballot because we think that we need to. Is because whomever we pick to be on that ballot has a legitimate chance of becoming First Minister. And because they earned it. Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, there have been an awful lot of women brought into cabinets, particularly by Mark Drakeford. So it might be that in the future, that is something that comes along in future leadership contests.
And I genuinely think that was something he had in mind in making his cabinet 50-50. He said some comments at the time, I remember, of having the best people means training the best, getting the best people that experience, so that when they run, they can go, yeah, I've actually had a massive portfolio for a few years.
Absolutely. Right. So final words, and I would encourage you to not be too cheesy about how you would sum up the leadership of Mark Drakeford as Welsh Labour leader and as First Minister of Wales.
Regular, reliable socialism.
Very nice. Matthew?
I mean, it's clear red water, isn't it, Rich? I mean, I know in my office, it's out of view now, but I've got the clear red water print with Rodri Morgan's face on it. But realistically, it should be Mark. Like the fundamental tenets of the Welsh Labour Party just don't exist without Mark Drakeford. Whether it's the progressive universalism, whether it's the taking a more forward step on being viewed as a Welsh party, changing the political centre of gravity in Wales so that it is no longer a question of left or right. It's about your question about your connection to your nation. Without that, I don't think Welsh Labour is where it is. So theoretically, without Mark Drakeford, Welsh Labour is nowhere near where it is now.
Wow, deep. I was just going to say memes. So
many memes.
I would, call me shallow. You're entitled to call me shallow. I will make the most of my privilege having the mic at the moment. Just to say, there are two things that I think have been particularly struck me over the years as Mark Drakeford. I mean, one is, I joke about the memes, but many of us will remember the catastrophically amateurish comms around Aston Martin several years ago that prompted an endless slew of gifs, well done Matthew, of James Bond related nonsense that was one of the worst government comms things I've ever seen in my life. And I have to say that under Mark Drakeford, one of the things that they have done is that they appear to have really upped their comms game, which I think is great and very welcome. The other thing I would also say, just from my personal experience, again, I did a lot of comms work around Brexit in the sort of 2016 to 2019 period when Mark Drakeford had the responsibilities for dealing with the response of that before he became First Minister. And he, again, just to applaud his very sensible unionism, a lot of his work at that time was around trying to make the UK union work better. And he was the early champion of improved intergovernmental machinery, trying to come up with a really sensible response. And I think one of the sad things is that unionists largely poo-pooed him and, have trampled over a lot of those ideas. And now we end up back in a situation where the United Kingdom Parliament is, and United Kingdom government is just simply throwing its weight around under the auspices of sovereignty. And actually where there was an opportunity for a better union, potentially post-Brexit, we have ended up with a slightly worse one in some regards. That's my personal reflection on it. I'm sure that our listeners will have enjoyed enormously listening to your insight on the Welsh Labour Party. If they would like more, Liz, can I encourage you to point people to a place where they can learn more or listen to you more?
You can. I usually post anything that I appear on Liz Silversmith on X, Twitter. I can't say it. I'm sorry, I can't say it. And yeah, that's pretty much where you'll find me.
Yeah, great follow, everybody. Highly recommended. Matthew.
You can find me on Twitter. I'm not calling it that. At Hexter101, HEXTER101.
Great, you're both in denial. If anyone has enjoyed this podcast, you can find us on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. And you can also get more information about the pod on our website, walespolitics.com. And if you have enjoyed listening to the podcast and would like to support us in doing more and, spoilers, more interesting work potentially involving Liz in the future, please consider supporting us from just £3 a month at patreon.com/HiraethPod.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.